Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back in another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have FTC officials took pricey gifts from Paramount as the company needed approval for billion-dollar deals from ProPublica.org, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian position here is you shouldn't need approval to merge your business. That's much, at least what one user, socialist or moron, said in the comments, and I would agree with that. But ultimately, since the government does require you to have approval before you merge a business with another business, the people should be, people are going to act in their own interest, and if someone wants something done when it comes to government, they will probably use bribery, even though it's technically illegal, as people are always going to act in their own self-interest, and the government's an example of that. A lot of people think government's going to be inherently, nonpartisan and for the people, but I would argue the opposite. Government's inherently going to be partisan and self-interested because everyone's going to always act in their own self-interest, and that includes the state. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have tariff refunds accelerated sharply in June as the U.S. paid out almost $50 billion to businesses from finance.yahoo.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and they added, hey, more socialisms for corporations but fuck the consumers, and I'd agree with that. The government shouldn't be paying off refunds to corporations, which, the government shouldn't be paying off anyone for anything, but, I personally do think the tariffs are unjust, but with that being said, the government shouldn't be bailing out people just because they paid them. When an individual, I guess, you do have tax refunds as well for individuals, but I definitely do think the government's much more willing to give refunds to corporations than it is to individuals, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Thomas Massey sparks a democratic civil war over Israel from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. Right now, I did respond to this on their post of this, the anarcho-capitalism subreddit, because I couldn't reply to it on this subreddit since they banned me like 300 episodes ago. But yeah, I replied, it's crazy that a country on the other side of the world is the biggest issue in the U.S. politics currently. If both major parties nominate Zionists for POTUS in 2028, maybe a third-party anti-Zionist candidate could win. I wouldn't really hold out hope that any third-party candidate could win, but I think that's a scenario in which they could possibly win, because people are very tired of Israeli influence in the U.S. government. The Democrats say Russian interference, the Republicans say Chinese interference, but I think Israeli interference is probably bigger than both of those combined, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Borders Czar warns there will be more bloodshed unless Democrats shut their mouths, from independent.co.uk, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for rhetoric like that, but ultimately people should be able to can justify saying whatever they want to. If you don't like it, that's fine. But ultimately, I think libertarian position is, we shouldn't have a militarized border, but I don't think we should have a completely open border either. Ideally, what I think people should focus on when it comes to borders is individual borders first and foremost. Ideally, I think ideally libertarians would have open borders, but I don't know if we can have open borders with a welfare state like we have currently. And I think that's why we should have moderately police immigration, maybe not too hard, not too soft either. But ultimately, people are going to justify what they want to justify, and that includes when it comes to movement, regardless of what the laws in place are. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rubio launches global effort to target left-wing terrorists. From posted by Lee Harvey Griswold, and that's cross-post, and that's a YouTube video link from Live Now from Fox. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for left-wing terrorists or right-wing terrorists, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter who the terrorists are. I would argue the state is the real terrorist. When the state commits violence, it's the law and completely justified. When an individual commits violence, that's just terrorism. It just goes to show you that it's classic pirates and emperors. When the emperor does something, it's the law. When an individual does it, it's the crime. And it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter what people do. It matters who does what. When it's an individual, the government doesn't like doing something that they don't like, it's terrorism. But when a government does doing something that the same thing but it likes it, that's suddenly just the law. Next, we have the absurdity of adding biological sex on ATF forms from lpclc.org, posted by Pariah Dog 119, and that's, I think, from the Libertarian Party Classical Liberal Caucus, and they said, selecting biological sex on ATF forms as proposed is a blatant overreach of state power, ATF mission creep, a waste of resources, gross negligence of scientific consensus on biology, and a violation of established case law. You can comment until August 4th on the Trump administration's latest assaults on the Second Amendment. If you like, you could simply copy and paste the text of the article, which is within the 5,000 character limit, and then they have a link to the regulations.gov where you can comment it, and they had furthermore the ATF must be abolished. Now I would agree with that. They commented, they did something similar to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit that I would agree with. They said, let me see if I can find it. They said new CCLC blog and ATF anti-trans rule, and they shared an image, armed minorities are harder to eradicate. And I said, Reddit will upvote stuff like this, then proceed to vote for the party that passes red flag laws, which enabled it in the first place. I don't think the Republicans are perfect on guns, but it's interesting how much worse the Democrats are on guns. And even if Reddit, they say, oh, we got to arm oppressed minorities, the Democrats are much more, even more open about taking away guns than the Republicans are, and that's saying something. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter which branch of the Union Party is taking your guns. You shouldn't be giving them up regardless of what the law says. So yeah, that's my thoughts there. Personally, I do think you might have some mental health concerns when it comes to transgender people owning guns, but ultimately, when it comes to the Second Amendment, it says shall not be infringed, and and that doesn't mean you can justify taking away anyone's guns regardless of what mental health impairments they might have, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Illinois will finally stop stripping people of their home equity 3 years after the Supreme Court allowed it, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And I would agree with that. Ultimately, the state can justify stripping you of whatever it feels like, because they're in the position of authority and you aren't. But yeah, I definitely do think you shouldn't be stripping people of anything if they don't consent to it, and that does include home equity. Next, we have Israel does not deserve more American money for weapons, Joaquin Castro, and that's a post by Rabat Ascalon, and that's a cross post from the Defund Aid to Israel subreddit. And I would agree with that. If Israel wants to buy weapons, I think it should be able to, but I don't think they should be funding, the U.S. taxpayers should be funding Israeli money for weapons with their dollars if they don't want to. That's why, ideally, we wouldn't have any taxation at all, but if we did have to have forced taxation, it should at least be able to earmark what you want to spend your money on. If the American government does want to send American money to Israel for weapons and the taxpayers are okay with that, fine. But right now you're forced to send your money there even if you don't want to, and I don't think that's very libertarian. Next, we have Blue Angels do a very low flyover at Florida Beach. Navy investigating your taxpayer dollars at work, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Abrupt Chaos subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really think the Blue Angels should be doing that, but ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it feels like a lot of time, and there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. As I say in pretty much every post. Next, we have From Pearl Harbor to Present, The Perils of Aggression from LP.org, posted by Fear the Creeper. And yeah, they shared some paragraphs from that article as well, but I'll just go into what I think about it. And I would agree that the perils of aggression aren't good. You shouldn't be aggressing on other countries. That's pretty much been the U.S. consistent foreign policy since post-World War II, though. I do think, the U.S. should be out of other countries rather than constantly intervening in other countries' affairs. It's why I think a lot of people really resonate with Donald Trump's America First messaging. But, they'll say America First on the campaign trail and then get off, and suddenly it'll become Israel first. So, it just goes to show you just really can't trust a lot of politicians at the words. Maybe Thomas Massey, he seems to be genuinely America first, but a lot of them, they're really just Israel first, or Ukraine first, or any other country besides the U.S. first, and that's not very, I would say, libertarian. Libertarian perspective is, I think, to support your own community first before the rest of the world, and that's my thoughts on that issue. I think if you want to support the rest of the world, you should be able to, but I definitely do think you should try and support your own community first. Next, we have Congress wants to keep funding a Pentagon that won't account for its spending, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I personally don't care for it, but it's the government. They're just going to burn through money regardless of who's in power. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. The Republicans are supposed to be the fiscally responsible party, but the national debt goes up just as much, if not more, than during Democratic administrations. And just to show you, they really are a uniparty. It's all just really theater. They agree on 95% of pretty much everything, and they use divisive divisive culture war issues like LGBTQ, whatever other layers they've added as well, and abortion to keep people divided. When in reality, they agree with pretty much everything behind the curtain. Next, we have Trump's illegal war is costing U.S. taxpayers $80 billion to $100 billion, according to the Pentagon, posted by then Data 9022, and that's cross-post from their own. I guess they posted it to their own account, and it's a cartoon. Great news! I solved another crisis I created. Isn't that fantastic? Trump says, and then J.D. Vance says, "You are amazing, sir." And then the LP added, all because Trump can't find an easy way out of this war. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think Trump's kind of responsible, but, I definitely do think, there are people who are arguing more responsibly, since the president's mostly figurehead, namely Israel and the deep state bureaucrats who are really running the show. Whatever you want to call them, military-industrial complex, deep state, satanic cabal, lizard people. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for endless war, but, it just goes to show, regardless of who's in office, there's going to be endless war regardless. I know a lot of quote-unquote progressives who loved endless war when it was about sending infinite money to Ukraine, but suddenly it's about sending infinite money to Israel to go to war against Iran, that they don't like it. And it just goes to show you they don't really have any values, only teams. They'll love endless war when it's marketed in the right way when it comes to U.S. involvement in Ukraine, Russia, but they'll suddenly hate it when it comes to U.S. involvement in Israel/Palestine, Iran. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump demands license revocations for networks that skipped his primetime speech from ibitimes.co.uk, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is government. We shouldn't have net licenses for anything in the first place. You shouldn't have to ask daddy government permission for anything. And if networks, we shouldn't have broadcast licenses, because ideally, no one really even cares too much about broadcast TV anymore outside maybe live sports. And no one's written. If Trump's mad that they didn't care for his speech, fine. But it's them having broadcast licenses in the first place is just proof that the government already has too much control over them. Ideally, their power is lessening as more people move on to streaming and social media rather than broadcast television. And I think that's why the state should be out of it. The state should be out of everything, but particularly broadcast television, since its influence is waning anyway. Getting the government involved isn't the right answer, as pretty much everything else. Next, we are going to use the entire force of the federal government. Steve Miller announces at State Department Summit that the federal government will debank, defund, and arrest left-wing political activists as terrorists, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's across post to the Critical Mineral Bulls subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But Reddit loved it when the Biden administration debanked, defunded, and arrested right-wing political activists. But of course, when it comes after their side, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show, it's really the people have no values, only teams. It's just who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. If the government does this to the out-group, it's the greatest thing ever. But it does this to the in-group, it's the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you that people don't really have any values. They'll want the state to oppress their enemies, but when the state suddenly starts oppressing them, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that's why I think libertarians are one of the few consistent people who are against deauthoritarianism of the state, regardless of which letter it has next to its name. But sadly, they're few and far between in an era where people are going to justify whatever the person with the right letter next to their name says. 40% of people are going to vote D no matter what. 40% of people are going to vote R no matter what. And really, the only remaining 20% are the only kind of principled people, and a lot of them are still going to vote D or R because third parties are just spoilers according to the myth, and that's my thoughts there. So we have one federal agency's unused office space costs hundreds of millions of dollars per year from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately the government can justify pissing away money on whatever bullshit it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump administration plans to spend $765 million to cancel 4 more wind farms, bringing total $2.6 billion from finance.yahoo.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's across post from an energy subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is to get the state out of energy in the first place. I think privately funded wind farms are fine, but having them government controlled means they can just cancel them any time, and there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, that's my thoughts there, but of course the progressives, they think the government needs to be involved in energy as much as possible and build as many wind farms as possible, because, they loved it when Biden probably signed off to build these wind farms, but suddenly Trump takes them down. It's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter, who's in charge. The government will justify pissing money away regardless. So ideally, we shouldn't have any government-funded energy products. They should all be privately funded. Next, we have Great question, Great question, Massey. We're waiting from Jedi Porcupine, and that screenshot of a tweet from Thomas Massey. When's the speech about Israeli interference in U.S. elections? Popcorn emoji. And I agree with that. As I said earlier, a lot of people are always going on about Russia, China, Iranian interference in U.S. politics, but I think Israeli interference is worse, all of those combined. But sadly, there's really nothing you can do about it, and they'll just throw you and a lot of Israel defenders will just throw the anti-Semitic label at you, and just like they're progressive, yelling racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, etc., etc. And yeah, you can name call all you want, but I think people are slowly but surely wising up. I don't really care for Donald Trump, but if there's one thing I have to give him credit for this term so far, is that he's been red-pilling a lot of people on Israel and its interference in U.S. politics, and that's something that I personally think is for the better. Next, we have Trump threatens to revoke ABC and NBC licenses for not broadcasting his election speech from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, we shouldn't have broadcast television licenses, but of course Reddit, I'm sure if the in-group president like Sleepy Joe threatened to revoke their licenses for doing something they deemed wrong, Reddit will think it's the greatest thing ever. And just go show you, they have no principles, only team. When the orange man does something, it's the worst thing ever. But when I'm sure when the in-group does the exact same thing, they'll justify it or sweep it under the rug or think it's the best thing ever. Next, we have John Fetterman is threatened to leave the Democratic Party. I say good riddance from MSNow.now, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for John Fetterman. I think he's very much one of the regime. But with that being said, it does take. I do respect him for one thing that he has a D next to his name, right? It still doesn't like him. It's not the reason they don't like him. Probably the biggest thing, Israel first and foremost, which I completely understand. But just go show you that you can even have a D next to him and Reddit doesn't like you, even if you vote in line if the DNC line 90%+ of the time, it just goes to show you, right? It just doesn't tolerate any dissent at all. With that being said, I personally didn't vote for John Fetterman. I did vote for him back when I was a Democrat in the 2016 primaries. But yeah, personally, I personally don't really care for him, and I think the big reason Reddit doesn't like him and that they're completely justified is how up Israel's ass he is, and that's very much justified. He's just another IPAC Dem who marketed himself as a progressive only to come into office and just be pretty much any other DNC shill who would justify whatever the DNC party line is. Even he says, I'm going to leave the Nicaragua. It's the only reason he's going to leave is because it's not pro-Israel enough, and they're pretty much just as pro-Israel as the Republican Party, if not more arguably. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, what are your thoughts on libertarian municipalism and why? Posted by Brian R. Lackey, 1987. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is if people want to form voluntary municipalities, they should be able to. But I don't think we should have forced collectivist municipalities. Ideally, but the big problem these days is forced collectivism. I think if we got rid of forced collectivism and people formed voluntary collectives, that would be fine. But I don't think people should be forced to collectivize other people if they don't want to, and that does include on the municipal level. Next, we have State Sovereignty and Trump's War Against the Constitution from TalkingPointsMemo.com, posted by Achilles Troyslayer. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump's war against the Constitution, but the Democrats don't really care for the Constitution either when they're in office, and Reddit doesn't care then. Reddit only cares because the outgroup's in power. But the second the Democrats take power again, they'll go back to not giving a shit about the Constitution. But suddenly then since the orange man's in power, suddenly it's the most sacred thing to them. It just goes to show you they're nothing but a bunch of phonies who are going to justify government authoritarianism as long as it has the right letter and color next to its name. Next, we have AIPAC closes donor portal to Democrats who voted to end aid to Israel from NYTimes.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't, I think, if they want to close their donor portal, that's fine, but just go show you how much influence money can have in politics. A lot of Democrats and Republicans want to sell out to Israel, and I personally think the ones who are taking a stand against Israel, even if I disagree with a lot of their other positions, are one of the few good people in Washington, so they're very least principled and not going to sell out their vote to the highest bidder. Next, we have some power companies are using eminent domain to seize land for data centers, as 70% of Americans say not in my backyard, from Fortune.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is if you want to build a data center on your private land, you should be able to. I personally wouldn't care for a data center in my backyard, especially if how noisy it might be. But ultimately, build whatever you want on your own property, even if it's a data center. And Yeah, I personally disagree with that power companies using eminent domain. I think that's very much government bullshit. The government shouldn't be taking your house from you because it feels like that your property may be very suited for something else. So that's my faults there. I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately, I don't consider myself entirely anti-data center, but I definitely do think they shouldn't be building them on property seized from eminent domain. Next, we have Abolish ICE, posted by Radiant Awareness 4878. And I would agree with that. Abolish all the alphabet agencies. Ultimately, the alphabet agencies are really the ones a lot of times really running the show when it comes to the government, filled with the deep state bureaucrats who are really making decisions rather than the elected officials. So I think, we should probably abolish all of them. With that being said, I don't know how likely it is because, ultimately, the government just seems to keep growing regardless of which branch of the party's in power, so it's likely we'll get more alphabet agencies rather than less in the future. But I definitely do think we should abolish all of them. Even if Reddit only wants to abolish ICE since it's more out-group coded than in-group coded. They never want to abolish something more in-group coded than out-group coded, like the EPA, for instance. But ultimately, I definitely do think you should try and abolish as many free-letter agencies as possible. Any government agencies, regardless of how many letters they have, I should say. Next, we have Erica Schwartz, Trump's pick to head the CDC, says abortion surveillance will be critical to her job at Senate hearing, raising legal questions from Jezebel.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. And personally, I wouldn't care for that, but ultimately the government can justify surveilling you however it feels like. Oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, ultimately, if they want to put this person in charge of the CDC, they can justify that. But yeah, personally, I wouldn't care for any government surveillance. But of course, Reddit only cares about abortion surveillance since abortion is one of their biggest values. They love surveying all the right-wing chuds for any wrong think at all. And I think the libertarian perspective is, you shouldn't have any government surveillance. Let people keep themselves. If they don't want to share something, they shouldn't be forced to do so, and the government shouldn't be spying on them without their consent. Next, we have DHS chief threatens to imprison election officials who don't clap Trump from truthout.org, posted by Mundane Image 14, and they added, "Fuck you, you authoritarian dipshit." And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the government can imprison anyone for whatever reason it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they control the courts and legal system as well. Next, we have Arkansas knew this private school harms students but kept presenting funds from ProPublica.org, posted by Knee Concussions, and that's across from the DeFranco subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think private schools should be receiving government money in the first place. I guess, you have the school voucher program that, but ultimately I think if people do want to spend their taxpayer dollars to private schools, I think they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to, so if they don't want to, especially if they're harming students. But with that being said, of course, Reddit, I'm sure if it was up to Reddit, all the schools being funded would be pro-LGBTQ, whatever others they've had as well, and all the Christian schools would get no money whatsoever. And if it was up to conservatives, it would be the Christian school, it would be the opposite. So yeah, ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is send money to whatever school you want to, for vouchers or something else. But ultimately, it should be individual in what type of school you're sending money to. Or if you don't want to send money to any schools at all, you shouldn't be forced to do so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Any Fellow Georgist here, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added, for context, Georgists, also known as single taxers, want to abolish income tax, corporate tax, capital gains tax, etc., and replace them with land value tax and severance tax and cut spending that can't be covered by those taxes. And they link to a poll of, are you a Georgist or not, I guess, yes or no. And yeah, personally, I like a lot of Georgist rhetoric, but I personally think the libertarian perspective is, even if the land value tax is probably the most justified form of taxation, it doesn't mean it's justified to the government imposing on you if you don't consent to it. If you don't consent to any form of taxation, you shouldn't be forced to do so, and that does include a land value tax. So that's my thoughts there. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.